Good evening and thank you. My name is Brad Blitz and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event titled Taking on Putin, From the Magnitsky Act to Resisting Russia's War on Ukraine, which is hosted by IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society, SSEES, UCL's School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and the European Institute. And we're most grateful to the Bloomsbury Theatre and to Susanna Downs and Lucy Shackleton for making this event possible. Now, it's almost 4 months since Russia invaded Ukraine. This is the second time. Second time during the presidency of Vladimir Putin. Of course, it's now 8 years since Russia occupied Crimea, and the current war has been a long time in the making, coming after conflicts in Chechnya and Georgia as well, which seemed more removed. But yesterday, the new head of the British Army, Sir Patrick Sanders, said, "There is now a burning imperative to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle. We are the generation that must prepare the army to fight in Europe once again." His comments followed warnings from NATO's Secretary General. The prospect of a European war with ground troops is a major shift. Until now, European involvement has been through the shipment of weapons and the application of sanctions, including smart sanctions, which target individuals associated with the Kremlin. According to the MOD, apparently some 15,000 millionaires are now trying to leave Russia. So clearly, people are worried. Yet outside of Russia, the war is raising questions about our access to and consumption of oil and gas. And the war is preventing Ukrainians from harvesting grain, with anticipated food shortages and price hikes all over the world, including in food insecure regions. And just today we've learned that Lithuania is imposing EU sanctions, or it's enforcing rather, EU sanctions on goods entering Kaliningrad, raising the stakes, of course, for the region. We are especially privileged to have with us the driving force behind the sanctions regime, Bill Browder, a hedge fund manager turned human rights activist who described himself as Putin's #1 enemy, but may have been knocked off the top spot by someone who addressed UCL students just last week in a khaki t-shirt. Bill's new book, Freezing Order, which is on sale in the foyer, is a gripping cat and mouse tale, which follows from his bestseller, Red Notice. And in truth, it is more frightening than any fiction on the shelf. Joining Bill to discuss the efficacy of sanctions is Dasha Afanasieva from Reuters, Orysia Lutsevych from Chatham House, and interviewing our panelists is Ben Noble, Associate Professor here in SSEES and co-author of a book on Alexei Navalny, who must also be competing for second place. So with that, I'll say thank you once again, and I will hand over to Ben.
So, yes, thanking the audience, those who are here, and also those who are joining us online. Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine has been met with a broad set of responses, from military resistance by the Ukrainian armed forces to unprecedented international sanctions. In fact, the war has galvanized efforts to confront Vladimir Putin in a way that previous cases of Russian aggression have not been able to do. But efforts to take on Putin are not new. This event will place Russia's war on Ukraine into this broader context of taking on Putin. I'm delighted to introduce the 3 speakers who will help us navigate this topic: Bill Browder, Dasha Afanasieva, and Orysia Lutsevych. Bill Browder is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. He was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was denied entry to the country and declared a, quote, threat to national security, end quote, for exposing corruption in Russian state-owned companies. The imprisonment, torture, and death of his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, in 2009 marked the beginning of a global campaign to impose targeted visa bans and asset freezes on human rights abusers and corrupt officials linked to the Putin regime. This campaign led to the adoption of the 2012 Magnitsky Act in the US and similar legislation in 33 other jurisdictions. As Brad mentioned, Bill is the author of Freezing Order, a true story of Russian money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath. Bill will begin by speaking for around 15 minutes about the book, after which I'll bring in our two other speakers as we broaden out from the book to Russia's war on Ukraine and what can be done now to take on Putin. Dasha Afanasieva is a columnist at Reuters Breaking Views, specializing in finance, Russia, and Turkey. In a piece published on the 16th of June, Dasha argued that Russia's economy will soon be unrecognizable, with poorer consumers and more basic modes of production, meaning that any returning foreign companies will find a very different economic landscape. Orysia Lutsevych is head of the Ukraine Forum and research fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. Orysia's research focuses on social change and the role of civil society in democratic transition in the post-Soviet region. For instance, in 2017, Orysia coordinated and co-authored a major Chatham House report titled The Struggle for Ukraine, which assessed changes since Euromaidan and provided policy recommendations. After discussion between the speakers, which will last for around 45 minutes, we'll then open up to Q&A with the audience, and I'll cover logistics about how to ask questions when we get to that point. But without further ado, let me hand over to Bill to talk about the book. Thanks, Bill.
Definitely not Putin's number one enemy anymore. I think that goes to Vladimir Zelensky. And I think not number two anymore, because that goes to Alexei Navalny, the person who you wrote so well about. But I would say that I'm solidly in third place for being Putin's number three enemy. And what evidence can I give to you for that? When I was writing, the first day that I was writing my book, it was July of 2018, and I was in Colorado, in Aspen, Colorado, and I had a blank sheet of paper, or I should say a blank screen on my computer, and there was so much terrible and crazy stuff that had happened to me in the campaign for justice for Sergei Magnitsky that I felt compelled. I thought it was like a really, really important that I tell this story and I write this book. And I'm easily distracted, and so I turned my phone on silent and I put it face down so I wasn't going to check Twitter or read emails or texts or anything. And I disconnected my computer from the internet, so I just had my Word document in front of me, and I tried writing. And about an hour went by, and I think I had like 3 sentences. I kept on deleting them and writing them and deleting them and writing them. And finally I gave up and turned my phone over, and there was just like a blizzard of messages, emails, texts, everything. And this was at the moment that I was trying to write this or start this book at the moment that the Helsinki summit, the summit between Trump and Putin, had just begun. And the messages all said something to the effect, are you watching this summit? They just talked about you. Putin just name-checked you. Putin, and so I immediately put everything aside, logged into my computer, got onto the summit, and what had happened was that the summit was taking place on a Monday morning, and the previous Friday, the Robert Mueller, who was investigating Russian collusion, had indicted 12 Russian GRU, military intelligence officers. And the summit was taking place, that was on a Friday, the summit was taking place on the following Monday. And so obviously that was going to be a question asked. And so after Trump and Putin had this secret meeting in which nobody else was present other than, I think, Putin's translator, they went out to this press conference, and one of the very first questions came from a Reuters correspondent who said, Mr. Putin, are you going to cooperate and hand over these 12 Russian GRU officers? And Putin, who had obviously been preparing for this question all weekend, sort of smiled and said, yes, it's entirely possible that we will, but but we only will do so if it's reciprocal. And we would want Donald Trump to hand over Bill Browder. And so then the obvious question was, what's Trump going to say? And so the next journalists went to Trump and said, Mr. President, what do you think about this? And he said, I think it's an incredible offer. And so I was expecting that within like half an hour after the summit press conference ended, some member of his staff would have met with journalists and said, actually, no, he didn't mean that. It was an incredibly bad offer or something like that. He left out the word bad, but nothing, total silence. And then the next day, the Russians did something even more incredible, which was, at that point, it was like a swap me for 12. And the Russians don't that seemed kind of a bit of a waste, and so they added 11 other names to their swapping list, including Ambassador Mike McFaul, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, the chief of staff of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, which is a major human rights body, the guy who wrote the Magnitsky Act, Kyle Parker, and 10 other people that had some connection to me and the Magnitsky Act or the justice campaign that I've been working on for the last decade. And so now it wasn't just me, and I should point out that I'm a British citizen, I'm not American anymore, and so maybe it's somehow acceptable for Trump to hand me over, but now all of a sudden they're talking about handing over the U.S. ambassador to the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and other government officials, and still a couple days went by, and then finally there was a moment when another press conference was taking place in the White House. And it wasn't with the president, it was with the president's PR person, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And the New York Times journalist said, are you going to hand over Bill Browder and Mike McFaul and the 10 others? And that was the moment I expected them to say, of course not, that's ridiculous. And she said, well, the president is considering the President Putin's request very seriously, and he's asking his advisors for advice. And it was only the very next day when the Senate was going to vote on whether or not to hand me over and the other 11, and the vote was looking like it was going to be unanimous that we shouldn't be handed over, that about an hour before the vote, Trump's press secretary meekly said, well, the president has considered it carefully and has decided not to comply with Putin's request at this time. And so I think I genuinely can say I'm in the number 3 spot. But the obvious question is why was Putin so? Why would he single me out at the summit? And the answer why, which is what my book is all about, is that I found his Achilles heel. And his Achilles heel is stealing money in Russia from the state, from anybody who he can steal it from, and then keeping that money in the West. And I was able to identify, and I didn't start out as a Putin money laundering investigator. I started out as a money laundering investigator into the money that Sergei Magnitsky exposed and was killed over. We discovered that $230 million had been stolen from the Russian government, or Sergei discovered it. He had exposed it, testified against the officials involved, and was killed for doing so. And after he was killed, I made it my mission to figure out who got that $230 million. And as we started to pull on the strings, we figured out who got some of that $230 million. Some of that money went to Vladimir Putin. It didn't go to him directly. It went to a very famous cellist. There's a man named Sergei Roldugin, who is a cellist in St. Petersburg. And he received some of this money. And he also received a whole lot more money from a bunch of other people, which was exposed in the Panama Papers. And everyone always, people said, why would this cellist end up, he had $2 billion, why would this cellist end up with $2 billion? And the answer is that this particular cellist is Putin's best friend from childhood. He's the godfather of Putin's daughter. He introduced Putin to his first wife, and he's Putin's nominee. He's his trustee. So we discovered that some of this money went to Vladimir Putin. And as we continue to pull on this string, we discovered that of the $230 million, $200 million had gone through one bank called Danske Bank, and through their Estonian branch, so 200 million of the 230 million. And we ended up sharing a bunch of information that we had with some journalists in Denmark from a newspaper called Berlingske. And they had access to another data leak, I think called the Russian Laundromat. And they were able to find out that, using our information and their information, that it wasn't 200 million that had flowed through Danske Bank, but it was 8.3 billion of stolen money from Russia that had flowed through Danske Bank. And of course, this created a major scandal for Danske Bank. Denmark is considered to be the second most honest country in the world based on Transparency International's index. They couldn't just leave it at that, and so the bank had to do their own investigation. And when they came up with the results of their own investigation, they discovered that it wasn't 8.3 billion. It was $232 billion of dirty Russian money had flowed through Danske Bank, Estonia. And so that's just one bank, one Danish bank and an Estonian branch. And I figure that if you were to lift the hood at Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna and Deutsche Bank and various other banks, that you get to $1 trillion. And that's actually the amount of money, the capital flight statistics that have come out of Russia. And so what has happened, based on my analysis, is that $1 trillion has been stolen in a 22-year period under Putin's leadership from the Russian state, from the Russian people, by 1,000 people, Putin and 1,000 people surrounding him. And that's money that should have been spent on healthcare, on schools, on roads, on public services. And instead, that was money spent on yachts, private planes, villas in the south of France, boarding schools for their kids in Switzerland, shopping trips for their girlfriends in Milan, etc. And because they've stolen all this money, and it's all in the West, first of all, I exposed a big part of it. And secondly, I created an instrument to seize that money or freeze that money. It's called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is this legislation which, named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of human rights violators and kleptocrats. Started out being just for Russia and has been expanded for the whole world. And so basically, I've created, so the entire mission of the Putin regime has been to steal money, and they've stolen a lot of it. And I've created a tool to go out and take that money away from them. And so no wonder they're so mad. And I believe that this $1 trillion is the defining characteristic of the Putin regime. And this $1 trillion is effectively what makes them do everything they're doing. I think it's the reason for the war in Ukraine. I think it's the reason for just about everything that's happening in the world right now. And I will end my prepared comments so we can discuss it, but that's what I think leads to everything.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. It's interesting what you say, that stealing money is the entire mission of the Putin regime. Stealing is what drives them. But I wonder whether you can say a bit more about how it explains the war in Ukraine, because one reading of the war in Ukraine is that it makes it more difficult for them to steal money. Putin has made his life much more complicated if really at the end of the day what drives him is theft. So I wonder whether you could just flesh that out a bit before I turn to Orysia to make the first comments and maybe ask some questions. Thanks.
So it's a great question. So first of all, let's back up a little bit. In the West, when someone goes to work in the government, they generally go to work to serve the people of the country. You go into public service to serve the public. I don't think there's a single individual in the Russian government that goes into any kind of government position, whether it's the lowest level traffic cop right up to the president of the country. Nobody goes for public service. Every single person goes to steal money. If it's a cop, they shake down the motorists. If it's the president, they shake down the whole system. And that is what, and if you ask any Russian person, if you think that they would look at you odd if you thought that anyone went for government service for any other reason than that. And so they've gone into government service to steal money, and there's a lot of money to steal in Russia. It's a very rich country, and they've stolen a lot of money. Now, the trouble when you steal so much money over such a long period of time is that it's not sustainable. Russia, in theory, is a democracy where people are supposed to vote every whatever number of years for things. And so people are angry about this kind of stealing that's going on. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Alexei Navalny became so popular, was he started to expose the stealing. And people say, well, but Putin wasn't worried. He was very popular. And I don't really believe that. I think that Putin was very worried. And he had good reason to worry, because we've seen it everywhere. It happened in Tunisia, where the leadership was stealing, and some guy sets himself on fire, a fruit seller, and all of a sudden the government gets overthrown. It happened in Egypt. It happened in January in Kazakhstan. A crook, a dictator who had been around longer than Putin and stolen more money per capita than Putin, got washed out in a period of 5 days because they raised gas prices. And so I think Putin was sitting there on the edge of his seat, worrying that at any moment he better be proactive about this, because he doesn't want to be sitting there and waiting for them to come for him. And so what does a dictator do when they're worried about losing power? And I should point out that at this point he's no longer worried about maximizing profit. He's worrying about getting kicked out, put in jail, have his money all taken away from him, and killed. That's what happens. And so what does a dictator do when they're worried about the people rising up? You want to make sure that they're not angry with you, they're angry at somebody else. And this is not rocket science. Dictators start wars when they want to distract their people. And I believe that the war in Ukraine is a desperate attempt by Vladimir Putin to distract his people, create a foreign enemy, get everyone all rallying around the flag, which they have done, by the way. He's extremely popular right now by creating this whole sort of nationalistic frenzy. And by the way, ironically, it may not be great for their savings in terms of having money frozen, et cetera, but it's absolutely excellent for their revenue. The oil income this year is $285 billion. It was $230 billion last year. And so I think that it's actually working out pretty well for Putin. I mean, he doesn't care about 30,000 soldiers that are killed. And by the way, he believes that all this money that's been frozen right now is going to be unfrozen when some new leader comes in some country. Maybe Donald Trump comes in again. Or, in France now, look at the far right has gotten something like 89 seats in their parliament. That Putin can just wait it out. And then all of a sudden the money will be unfrozen, and he has all this revenue, and he's got control of everything. That's a great scenario for him.
Thanks. So, Orysia, some comments, and then feel free to ask Bill a question.
First, I would like to rebrand Bill and two other warriors. I would not call you enemies of Putin. I would call you the warriors for justice, because I think this is what it is. I think you and Alexei want justice to prevail in Russia, and the Russian people get what is theirs, what they've been robbed through, and then they've been manipulated into this klepto-nationalism, I would call. And then President Zelensky, very much empowered by the change that happened in Ukraine throughout the last, I would say 20, 15 years, but especially catalyzed after the Euromaidan uprising and everything that went through in Ukraine after the first Russian-Ukrainian war and the annexation of Crimea. I mean, I think it's important to understand that it's a very strong feeling of justice in Ukraine as well. And what, the famous slogan after the First World War, never again, something that in Ukraine now people say never again, there will be impunity for Russian crimes, be it imperial period crime, Bolshevik crime, Stalinist crime, Putin crimes. There is a clear legacy that Ukrainians see why this war became possible is because Stalin's crimes were never condemned like Nazis' crimes, and Putin blended this kind of very dangerous ideology with a lot of money. And I think we have to be very self-aware also here in the West about the origins of this war, and to open our eyes to how we also, our system, enabled mass killing that is taking place now in the center of Europe. And this comes from Bill's case, that he describes how basically Russian state is captured and how billions were put into, instead of human development in Russia, rearmament and this imperial frenzy of Putin that gives him that shield, the story behind the money for the Russian masses and disinformation and propaganda. This is a joint venture between Russia and enablers here in the West, in London, in Malta, in Vienna, in Denver, you name it, right? There's already a map of those places. And also, I mean, because we are here with the UCL, I think another reason for this is the kind of intellectual laziness we've had from the collapse of the Soviet Union to today, believing that, it's the end of history and now this region or Russia will become like us, and not studying enough countries like Ukraine, countries like Georgia, like Moldova, like Belarus, and paying foreign policy attention to this. De facto, in Ukraine, the discourse now is that Russia is not a nation state. Russia is still an imperial power, and these are the pangs of falling empire, and there will be a very serious process going on internally in Russia that will have to be recognizing its ethnicities, its identity as a nation state, and this is a collapsing Soviet Union we are facing right now, and I think we should be very aware of that. And also, there was a complacency about the nature of Putin's regime, about all the human rights and foreign policy driven by trade and investments. I think it's important to understand that there are no borders, that this regime can penetrate our societies, and it's a threat to democracies. We gave them open door and put the red carpet for this to happen. And this is about educating our publics about the danger of it, because it will cost now. The gas prices, the utility prices, the food prices, on top of Brexit disaster, all of this will be costly here, right? And people ask question, why should we finance war in Ukraine? And it's 5 billion now that Ukrainian budget needs in support. So I think understanding this gives us a very important perspective. And also, we have to be brave enough to tell honestly and start developing that idea of what it is that we want Russia to be. It's not that we will be doing it instead of Russian people, that somebody is taking away agency from Russia, but as Ukrainians, as the Brits, as French, I would like to see a failure of this klepto-nationalism. I think there will be no safe Europe until we contain that and this imperial revanchism stops. And I think inside Russian elite, there has to be a revolution that this is not a viable proposition. I think they still believe it's a viable proposition, that they should have a sphere of influence, that they should have, open door policy in the West, that they could milk one cow and enjoy, profits in another. And I think that we have to make everything that the cost outweighs so much the benefits that eventually, I'm not saying it's going to happen now, the questions will be asked and the answer will be no, it's not a viable proposition, and Russia has a different role and place in Europe. And in between this moment and today, there is this intermediate period which I think we have to think, how do we support Ukraine and Ukraine's victory? And I'll be honest with you, Ukrainians are very ambitious about what this victory means at this point. Just to give you two numbers, 45% of Ukrainians believe that the victory is to push Russian troops all the way to 2014, basically restoring territorial integrity of Ukraine. And 1% believes that the Russian army has to be destroyed in Ukraine and insurgency has to be supported inside Russia. This is a very ambitious goal, and this is why, because Ukrainians understand that the current modern-day Russia is a threat. You can militarize Ukraine, you can build a wall, you can become a member of any alliance, but until there is a change inside Russia, there can be no peace, because there will be continuity. And I think that it's very important that meanwhile we mitigate the risks, and that we really support that Ukraine's agency. And I will tell you also that inside Ukraine, no matter what happens in these coming very difficult months and weeks, there is a very clear understanding what Ukraine has already won. And it will always be there. And one is that there will never be any inferiority complex between Ukraine and Russia, which Russians so well fed throughout years and years and years. If you've been ever to Kyiv, you know the arch of friendship between Ukraine and Russia, the monument, has been dismantled. There's no more shadow of the empire. There's been a very strong emancipation. The Ukraine is getting EU candidate status. Ukraine is coming back to Europe as a full-fledged member of European community. And as a result of this war, Ukraine is becoming a much stronger state because of the trust to institutions as the result of, quite successful leadership and mobilization will make Ukraine a much more cohesive and viable state. So I'll stop here.
Thanks for that, Orysia. Now, Dasha. Sanctions, and anything else you'd like to touch upon?
Right, yes, I'd like to pick up on this point that Bill raised, which is that Putin economically is actually having a very good war. There's truth in that, because they moved really quickly and there was really savvy macroeconomic management. So indeed, the ruble now is actually stronger than it was just before the war. But there's actually a lot more to it. And I think that even though the economy hasn't slowed as quickly as some people predicted, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be painful. If we look at just in summary some of the major sanctions that have been brought in, Russia can no longer import the really sophisticated microchips, for example. That's why Apple had to leave. One of the reasons, there were several reasons why Apple had to leave, but that's just one of them. IBM's left. Its businessmen, a lot of its businessmen have been sanctioned. Its bond markets have been sanctioned. Its companies have been kicked off Western capital markets. These things are, in the long term, going to have a huge impact on the economy. The central bank itself already admitted that the economy is going to transform structurally. It's going to be a much less sophisticated, not that it was, Taiwan beforehand, but all methods of production are going to become a lot less efficient. To take a colorful example, Russia has announced that it's going to build its sanctions-proof Lada car. It's not going to have airbags. It's not going to have ABS. It's not going to have, the latest seat belts. That's not a car, and it's still going to be super expensive. That is not a car that many Russians are going to want to drive. So I think that even though there hasn't been this cliff edge, I think it's important to remember that that's not what you'd expect with especially macroeconomic sanctions. Iran didn't sort of fold over and collapse overnight. And the irony is that, over time, Putin got handed a very lucky card in terms of the economy. Rising oil prices meant that living standards went up by a lot in the first decade or so of his rule. And ironically, he's completely undone the good parts of his economic legacy, which is rising standards of living and also access to capital markets, which meant that Russian companies could grow so that you got these state champions like Sberbank and Rosneft and Gazprom, all sort of problematic companies in terms of transparency or in terms of efficiency, but still on capital markets, Russia was killing it. So in a way, I think that some leaders would prefer to have their legacy be in improving standards of living, prosperity, but Putin was not able to sustain that, and there were sort of semi-half-hearted efforts to actually improve the development of the country that have now all been shelved. But there's a recognition that there was stagnation, and that stagnation has now turned into degradation for the Russian economy. So I guess I guess I just invite everybody to consider that it's not horrific. It's not super painful. It's not enough to get people to change their mind overnight. But over time, today's sanctions do have an impact.
So do you think there's been maybe a failure of communication in the West about what sanctions can do and the timeframes involved?
Well, I think there's maybe that, and also I think they sounded so tough. And in the first few weeks, and I was one of those people that said, there could be bank runs, there could be complete loss of confidence, and that was probably. Putin was very lucky that he managed to persuade Nabiullina to stay, because she is a very competent policymaker, and she really didn't want to do capital controls. That was apparently her red line, and she stayed and she stuck with the capital controls that they're now gradually easing. And I think that there was maybe a communication failure, but I think it's also. There's also now a suppression of economic data in Russia. We're not going to get a really full. We're going to have to be sort of macroeconomic sleuths to really get a full understanding of what's happening with the economy, especially with people, with journalists, with analysts, economic analysts all having to leave. And I think that it's just a much slower process, because I think just as if you think about the COVID pandemic, the state didn't support companies very much, but they took on the financial burden of getting the country through that. And I imagine now also there's also this time lag because they're using their own reserves, they're sort of not making people redundant, whereas maybe they should, before actually getting any support for the state, which, as Bill mentioned, there will be potentially money to provide because of the massive oil and gas revenues.
Bill, I don't know whether you want to respond to those comments.
So I think that you're right. Well, so I was saying he's having a good war so far, and you sort of supporting that. And so in terms of the economy, hasn't fallen off a cliff. But I think it's going to fall off a cliff. So if you look at Venezuela, I think Venezuela is the best comparable. Venezuela, when they went rogue, they renationalized a bunch of the foreign oil companies, and then they lost all of the American oil service companies. And as a result of that, Venezuela went from being one of the biggest oil producers in the world to a collapse in oil production. And Russia is going to have the same thing. There's no indigenous Russian oil service companies. They rely on Western oil service companies and Western technology. And the only thing they really have is oil and gas. And the other thing which is quite interesting is that Putin is like really hitting hard and cutting off and restricting the flow of gas. That's his only source of revenue. So in the medium term, I think that Russia is going to have a collapse in the production of oil. And in the medium term, all of this withholding of gas, what are you going to do if you're Germany? Even if you wanted to continue to buy the gas, which they kind of do, they're going to have to diversify. And so the numbers are pretty extraordinary. I think that it was like 40% of budget revenues come from oil and gas. If that goes down, that's pretty bad for what in my opinion, what Putin is banking on is that he and the Russians can survive economic pain because it's a dictatorship, and he doesn't go to the polls and doesn't have any real media or anything like that to criticize him. They can suffer through economic pain a lot longer than we can. And so they can stomach like a 25% decline in GDP, but if we in our democracies have a 3% decline in GDP, every one of our governments is going to be gone. And he's hoping that he creates such chaos in the world through all the stuff that's happening right now that something breaks his way, and it always does. I mean, things always seem to go his way because he doesn't have the same, all these different pressures on him. And so I think that he's gambling now. He's betting that the pain we're gonna say uncle before he does.
It's interesting because Putin's rise to power was based on this social contract where he was getting rich and Russians were getting rich. I mean, that's the end of the era. He got rich, but Russians from now on going to get only poorer. And, you know, there's nothing more damaging to a dictator or the two phobias. One is a revolution, the other one is a failure at war. Putin, you know, himself got, you know, control over internal opposition, put Navalny in prison, destroyed his network. Now he feels like he has that under control, and the Russian state will only become more and more repressive. You know, and we see the exodus from Russia and fear. Fear is the main emotion now in Russia. People are not stupid, they understand what's going on, but they are afraid. But, you know, I'm afraid that Putin is going to choke on Ukraine if the West maintains cohesion and maintains unity, and I think this is.
But he. I mean, just look at it. You know, we're here. We are right now,
yep.
And the Germans are saying, why don't you just settle? The French are saying, don't humiliate. You know, allow Putin to save face.
Yeah.
And God knows what's going to happen with all these elections in different countries with oil prices at $125 a barrel.
There are risks of that, but I think what Dasha was saying is that, you know, there is a time lag with the effect of what has already been imposed on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe 8.5, or how you want to, you know, the sanction pressure that's been put on Russia. It will bite and bite and bite. And, you know, honestly, I also have, you know, memories of the collapse of the Soviet Union as it was described at that time. Think about the unexpected event, like Chernobyl that happened, that actually, you know, it was the catalyst for many, many things happening in that particular space. So, of course, there are things we don't see at the moment. And of course, I think for policymakers and for advocates, we have to recommend what is right. We don't know what will be the outcome of it. But when you look at what Putin is doing and with the atrocities, Putin's legacy is war crimes. This is his legacy. Putin's legacy is, you know, this kleptocracy that he built and stole. Putin's trillion part of it will be used to rebuild Ukraine and repay the victims. This issue will stay with Russia no matter where Putin is for decades. And I think this is something that Russians have to start thinking about, how they see the future of their own country that is different from what Putin offers right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think apart from the problem of Western governments being a lot more democratic, that you know, MPs and leaders of countries are afraid to suffer politically through the economy slowing down. I think the other thing is that Europe in particular financially is in a much weaker position, and they can't afford the kind of pain that maybe Russia can. And Putin was preparing for this for a long time, you know, with $600 and something billion of FX reserves. And, you know, the West was really good and sort of arguably quickly brought in sanctions to freeze half of that, make it useless, but there's still the other half. And I think that's what, you know, in terms of the kind of catching up to Putin, because he knew he was going to do this. Yeah.
Well, there's one unexpected thing. So in my mind, I think these high oil prices are the single biggest problem, single biggest benefit for Putin and the single biggest problem for the West, because every day he gets $1 billion a day flows into his coffers from these high oil prices, and $1 billion a day is what he spends fighting in Ukraine. And at the same time, these high oil prices lead to this cost. We're going to have the entire country here is going to go into lockdown tomorrow because of strikes. Why are the strikes? Because of inflation. Why inflation? Because of high oil. Well, one of the reasons, high oil prices. And it's going to be happen. I was just listening to the BBC this morning, and I didn't realize this, but Sri Lanka has just defaulted on their debt, and Pakistan is next, and so on and so forth. And so the world is going to go into this crazy sort of chaos because of high oil prices. So that's Putin's big thing. But I also don't think, if you were to, you know, if you look at the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of people have theories about why the Soviet Union fell apart. My theory is that it was $10 oil, that putting everything else aside, they couldn't afford it. And Putin can afford to do just about anything with $125 oil, and so oil prices have to go down in order for the Ukrainians to win, for the West to stay together. And I actually think that oil prices will go down, and will go down a lot. At $125 oil, every single person who produces oil is going to start pumping oil shale, all sorts of oil projects, all sorts of supply is going to start coming out, all sorts of Germans are going to start doing solar, et cetera, and people will stop driving as much. And I think that you could easily see an oil price crash, and that will probably be the demise of Putin as opposed to a military demise.
I mean, you need OPEC on board.
And OPEC will get on board as well. I mean, Saudi Arabia only exists through the good graces of the United States of America. It doesn't have, Saudi Arabia couldn't exist if the United States didn't protect it. And the implicit deal was for many, many decades that they provided stable oil prices in exchange for military umbrella. And so, they can play around in the short term, but Saudi Arabia will pump more oil if that's what they have to do to stay existing. And I think that America and UK have been way too lenient, and they should go to Saudi Arabia, as they're doing right now. I don't know what's happening behind closed doors, but no more gentle, coaxing with these guys.
So looking ahead, the book, of course, charts how you have tried to take on Putin, and quite successfully. Looking ahead, what do you think are the main steps that you're going to be taking, but also the recommendations for governments, especially if interest in maintaining a collective West, a Western resolve, if we've already seen governments starting to tire, and also publics having less interest in what's happening in Ukraine. What do you think are the recommendations that you would give to others?
Well, it comes back to oil. So I think that every policy should be about oil and alternative energy. Every policy every government should pursue right now should be about reducing the price of oil through more oil production and through allies producing more oil and through taxing the consumption of oil so that people drive less, and anything that you can do to bring down the price of oil so that it's not an asset for Putin, and it's not that has to be the first thing. And then, by the way, we haven't talked about food. So Putin has also created a global starvation crisis, and it's just starting to come into being. But 40% of the world's wheat is produced by Russia and Ukraine, and that wheat has now been blockaded. And so as a result, the countries all over the world, we have inflation. Africa and Asia and Latin America have starvation. And that's a problem that could be fixed pretty easily. Why is the wheat stuck? Because Russia has got a bunch of warships outside of Odessa. I think that if the United Nations has any function at all, and I don't imagine the United Nations will do the right thing here, but if you have world starvation because of one country, shouldn't you then say there should be a UN project to make the Black Sea fully safe for export of wheat? And if the United Nations doesn't do it, which they won't, then NATO plus should do it, and that has to be a policy. And the United States approved a budget of $41 billion for Ukraine, and $9 billion of that was for starvation in Africa from Ukraine. Why not spend $1 billion just making the Black Sea safe and save all that money? Maybe it doesn't cost $1 billion, I don't know. But the point is that you have these two. Putin has weaponized wheat and he's weaponized oil, and we have to unweaponize that as quickly as we can. And then, of course, we have supplied enough weapons to the Ukrainians not to lose, but we haven't supplied enough weapons to the Ukrainians to win. And so, and it's just starting to happen right now. We've given them long-range artillery, which is crucial to this whole thing. And if you read the sort of granular situation reports, it's now starting to become more painful for the Russians. And we should give the Ukrainians everything they ask for. And then, of course, we should absolutely tighten up the sanctions to the point where it starts to really hurt. And as you said, it's not hurting yet. And so if it's not hurting, then we need to do more. And what for? And that's basically to starve Putin of the financial resources to continue to be able to afford this war.
Well, I think one of the themes in your book and covering Russia's economy and finances more generally is how porous the lines between state money, businessman money, oligarch money, Putin's money and criminal money. You just don't, they move around freely within those brackets, which is why I think that so long as you still have lots of unsanctioned businesses, there's an opportunity for for billions to still be entering the country. And of course, the biggest bracket of that is energy, because those are the biggest exports and the things that represent the biggest chunk of the budget. But you also have, your nickel producers, your aluminium producers, your steel. The world's biggest diamond producer is partially sanctioned, and it's Russian, but it's still not considered, for example, a conflict diamond. I think they're debating that now. So another answer to why Russia's economy is fighting back is that sanctions have been remarkably strong and massive, and lots of agreement was reached very quickly, but there's still a ton, a way that they could go if policymakers wanted them to.
If I may just give an idea to the audience, I mean, overall, you'd say in the UK there is like 900 individual sanctions, in US 852, EU 700. So these are the numbers. Navalny put a list of 6,000 people. This is the scale we're talking about, where we are after actually the fact that Putin is not changing his objective vis-a-vis Ukraine. They keep at it, right? They're talking about denazification, talking about, basically raising Ukrainian town and villages in the east. It's a total war of attrition, total, and destruction. And I think that given that into account, we have to put more individuals on sanction lists. And it's not about actually motivation for uprising, it's demotivation from Putin's system. Because Putin's loyalty is based on, as I said, I am very rich, you are a little rich. So they were all, benefiting from the system. So it's not just a couple of guys who are getting rich. It's like spreading throughout, and all these payments in loyalties and contracts and corruption. It's an octopus, right? So I think that where we have to step up is more individuals on sanctions list. I mean, there is an interesting report prepared by Mike McFaul, University of Stanford, working together with Ukrainians. There's specifically talking about individuals, and they actually recommend putting 12,000 individuals. And also, before you impose these sanctions on individuals, asset freezes and visa bans, they say, okay, this is a public list. If you defect and publicly condemn the system, you may be exempt from sanctions. Because, I mean, as long as everybody stays loyal and the system works, I think that basically means that all the Russians support it. It means they are participating in war crimes and this illegal aggression and crime against peace. So I would say that there's still a lot to do here. And another pillar of what to do next, I think it's bolstering Ukraine, because Ukraine is fighting Western war. Putin is at war with the West. And I think that you're right about military assistance, and there's not exactly the timing is what is needed on the battlefield. There's a lag, because, to be honest, these are very complex systems of armaments, but also recovery. The Ukrainians are already thinking about how to rebuild Ukraine better, and we shouldn't wait until post-war. I think Ukrainian recovery has to take place alongside in order to enable Ukrainian resilience, in order to enable to achieve some of those, not all, but some of those ambitious objectives, to finally, have a new security architecture in Europe we all want, and I'm sure Russians want, but as long as this regime is in power, I hardly see how this is possible. So I think we are into a period of strong turbulence. Each of us has to develop a quite strong threshold for pain. Otherwise, we will just procrastinate and we'll have another third Ukrainian-Russian war, because Putin will not stop at where, Donbass, if you say. There will be assault on Odessa, there will be Black Sea. They talked about it, so we should better pay attention to what they're saying. And we have to prepare. We have to prepare to deter, to defend, and, to defend democracy also here. There's a lot to do. It's quite daunting, to be honest, but I think it's feasible if we have the right mindset.
And if the populations of the West are prepared. I think
and
there
if they understand.
And if they understand why they sacrifice. I don't think at the moment that project is being undertaken as effectively as it should be.
Yeah, because, you know, I think, of course, presenting it as it is just about Ukraine, defending Ukraine. I don't think it's about defending Ukraine. It's about defending, you know, rule-based order where, you know, the country's borders are not changed by force, and where the major nuclear power is threatening nuclear, you know, annihilation, blackmailing, and what kind of messages will it send to other nuclear powers or aspiring nuclear powers? And I think if we allow this behavior to prevail, we are in a big, big trouble globally.
You know, I was very worried about, all throughout the Magnitsky justice campaign, I was always worried that people would stop paying attention to me, that journalists would stop returning my calls, that I would become irrelevant. And it never happened. And the reason it never happened was because Putin always did something more outrageous to make what I was doing relevant. And I think that's a sort of microcosm of what I believe is going to happen going forward, which is that I think that everyone's natural instinct is to get upset with gas prices and not pay attention to what's going on in Ukraine. But Putin is not going to let people stop paying attention to him, because he just doesn't, his whole modus operandi in every conflict he's ever been involved in is just to escalate, and do more outrageous things. And as you say, his legacy is not, he has no good legacy. He doesn't care about legacy. All he cares about is, he doesn't want to be loved. He doesn't want to be, all he wants to be is feared. And right now he's not even feared enough, and he's going to do something really outrageous. The outrageousness of what he does is going to be so horrible that everyone is going to come back and as we were discussing at the very beginning, the British, you know, the most senior general in the British Army is like now telling the troops, you're going to be fighting Russia. You know, I think that everybody kind of understands that he's going to continue. Whether we like it or not, this is not a war of our choosing, but it's a war of his choosing, and he's going to continue to make himself more and more toxic and more dangerous, and we're all going to be. My prediction is we're all going to be sitting here years from now having the same conversation.
I hope you're wrong.
Well, it's not going to be just about Ukraine anymore. It's going to be this conversation about Vladimir Putin and other places.
But what do you think about the pushback internally in Washington, in London, and is there any? Because the thing that was interesting, one of the things that was interesting in Freezing Order was how it was US lawyers, you know, the likes of John Moscow, who were Putin's, you know, helpers in the West. And in the UK, I think we've stopped lawyers representing Russians, or there's a bit of pushback for their
lawyers
exemptions.
can still, but the consultants and the PR agents and the private investigators can't. Well, right now, everyone's hiding under their table and pretending they never worked for the Russian government or Russian oligarch. But you know, everybody, the money is going to start creeping back in, and so I mean, as you said, it's all, you know, Russian crime, Russian government, and Russian oligarchs are all, it's all merged effectively, and they're gonna they flash money around, and that money, people are greedy, and so and they use oligarchs as agents, and then those oligarchs use people here in London and New York and all these other places as agents, and I think that's until we kind of. And that eventually will get tightened up when we realize that this is like a national security risk. This is not just like, you know, not everybody is entitled to a legal attack, you know, to hire lawyers to go and terrify journalists and stuff like that, which is what the Russians do.
Okay, so I think we've now reached the point where we can open up to Q&A from the audience. So if you have a question, you know the drill, you've already started. Raise your hand and I will call on you. I'll pick people out. A roving mic will get to you, so please wait until the mic gets to you before you start asking the question. So let me look into the audience. I see we have lots of hands raised. I think the first one was actually at the back. So the gentleman at the back, please, in the white shirt. And please do introduce yourself briefly before asking the question. And we'll be taking the questions in threes. Over to you.
Make it quick. Ewan Grant. I'm now a de facto commentator on the war. Ms. Lutsevych and Mr. Browder know me, vice versa. My question is, for all of you, please, if you had 5 copies to give to people who should have known better and perhaps should still know better of the book, to whom would you give those copies? I have to apologize to Mr. Browder. In my broadcasts, I've been referring to Tom Clancy, no less, Command Authority and Commander-in-Chief. Prophetic textbooks. But Mr. Browder might well wonder if Tom Clancy took quite a lot from him. It's really uncanny. I would advise everyone here to read his book and then carry on to the others and Catherine Belton's. You'll be staggered at the similarities. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Ewan. The second question to the gentleman with the glasses here. Thanks. You've taken them off.
Peter Jukes, Byline Times. I was just wondering if you are being a bit pessimistic and talking about Putin's great capacity for evil wisdom. Has he not severely miscalculated? I was in Europe, I was in Brussels, Guy Verhofstadt was saying about EU accession for Ukraine and rebuilding Ukraine. We have Finland and Sweden joining NATO. And clearly his initial plan to decapitate Ukraine was misconceived, badly executed, corrupted, inefficient, even snipping off a little bit now of Luhansk's project is stalling. So I'm just asking you, is he, the great misinformation, Bill's been a victim of it, I've seen it for 15, 20 years, in the end, does the dictator become a victim of his own disinformation?
Thank you for that. And then the third question of this initial round, if you can just hand it to the person right in front of you. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Alexei. I'm from Siberia, oil and gas. So thank you very much for good presentation. My question is very simple. I have traveled recently through 3 different countries: Russia, China, and Arab Emirates. On 3 countries, I found their following similarities. In the last 20 years, people living better and better. Better and better, yeah. In 3 countries, it's the same totalitarian regimes. Almost, well, very, very similar. So, following what Dasha was saying, do you think it's about people and what's in their heads? So you cannot put certain order to certain country and expect this country to act like a democratic country. And if it's true, how long should we wait? Or shall we think about history? Why Russians always expanding their empire? Why it's happening? Because of Vikings? I don't know. I just thinking aloud. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So 3 questions. Who wants to begin about the 5 copies of the book?
Well, I think and what I thought of, apart from sort of acquaintances in Russia that none of you know would have any interest in, was the people, the conservative government at the time of the Litvinenko murder and then the Salisbury poisoning. I did find it incredible that a government put up with, a policeman, someone being murdered on their soil, and then a policeman being like accidentally murdered on British soil, and that there was some sort of wrist slapping. Basically, I think there were some diplomats that got moved around because I think it's now understood that a lot of Russian embassies basically have the work of espionage. So I think that was really incredible because there was just really no case to not react to that a lot more strongly. And I think the only reason why there wasn't a stronger reaction is because of the huge volumes of dirty money that makes its way through London.
Well, I don't know. I just came up with 2. I think Scholz should read it definitely because there was a very strong theme of thinking in Germany that economic relations with Russia will eventually democratize Russia, and this was like this Ostpolitik, whereas I think they misunderstood modern Russia from Soviet Union, whereas Soviet Union really needed foreign exchange. I mean, Soviet Union had to buy grain. It was such a faulty economy that they had to buy grain to feed Soviet citizens. That's why they were selling energy, behaving relatively well, because they needed to sustain, especially from the 70s and onwards. They were self-containing, right? I mean, that is not modern day in Russia, obviously. And I think Jake Sullivan should also read it, because I think he's a bit wobbly on that. I mean, the Biden advisors, they came there with a clear idea that they'll focus on China, and we had that meeting between, I mean, that was actually bending into bully. If you remember, the first build-up up to the war was in April of 2021, and then the meeting between Biden and Putin that took place after that escalation. I think that was a wrong move to encourage, endorse that kind of policy by Biden. And I think that I mean, personally, I think in this dynamic between Russia and China, it will be China who will be the older brother, and Russia will be, in a way, weakened by Western sanctions, selling its resources cheaper to China. And to be honest, if we are talking geopolitics, in 15 years' time, there will be European sphere of influence and Chinese kind of way of doing business and European way of doing business. I mean, Ukraine has chosen where it belongs. Russia is trying to say, oh, no, there's some Russian way of doing business, while, we're antagonizing the West and having an unlimited partnership with China. But I think that is utopia, and they will see it happening. On Peter's question about, I think, completely counterproductive everything Putin does, if we consider, his goals. We will correct the historical mistakes, and will make Ukraine a friendly country. This is how he is going about it. It has a completely opposite result. Finland is joining NATO because of those proposed treaties in December. That actually what tipped the public opinion in Finland, where they felt that Russia is setting a limit on NATO enlargement and undermining their sovereignty, and Finnish public opinion was ready at that point. It wasn't even so much the aggression against Ukraine. Okay, of course, it was the last drop in fire, but I think that this is what happens in the ivory tower of Kremlin, and actually this is what happens when you have such pervasive corruption. Like you pretend you're paying us, we pretend you're working. There's a lot of that legacy plus money that is not being spent on proper things, misinformation given to the dictator, and here you have. But I'm very happy Putin miscalculated Ukraine. If he has prepared well, we would have been in a much more difficult situation.
So on the question about traveling through Russia, China, and the United Arab Emirates, and having everybody better off, my response to that is there's not a lot of people I know who are desperately trying to emigrate to China, Russia, or the United Arab Emirates, and there's a lot of people from those countries who are very desperate to emigrate to countries with freedom and democracy and property rights and law. For what it's worth, I don't think China has got a bright future ahead of it. I think China's got a lot of nastiness coming in store in not too distant future economically, which may be very terrible for the rest of the world, but that's. And then on this miscalculation question, you're making a huge assumption in this miscalculation question, which is what Putin cares about. So does Putin really care about NATO enlargement? Does he really care about the European Union? And does he really care about the loss of life of losing 30,000 soldiers? And I'm sure he doesn't care about any soldiers. He could lose 10 million people and that would still not move him. He's a psychopath. He has no empathy. And I would argue that everything that he's said in all these speeches, that every political scientist and learned individual has quoted, is purely for public consumption for the Russians. He's not a nationalist. He's not a patriot. Because if he was a nationalist and a patriot, he wouldn't have stolen $1 trillion from his own country over 22 years. Every single word he has said is just pure manipulation. And he hasn't miscalculated. His only calculation was, is he more firmly in power now than he was before the war? And he's more firmly in power. And so I think that, and this is really important because, like Macron says, we should, give him something so he can save face. It has nothing to do with that. This only has to do with him staying in power. He's not going to negotiate on anything because it shows weakness. And so I don't believe that I think that we, in the West, we've all bought into his bullshit. We've all watched and read and thought about all this stuff. And as a result, we're miscalculating how to deal with him because we think if we give him this, we negotiate that none of that works. That doesn't work with this type of guy.
But I think it's also quite smartly done on the part of Putin to make the West guilty. Maybe we shouldn't have enlarged NATO, then, there would not have been this war. It's done on purpose to, feature and spread these narratives about the Western guilt vis-a-vis Russia, because it takes away attention from exactly the kleptocracy that has been built inside Russia that is a true reason for the kind of war we have. The state capture by a group of FSB bodies, and then indoctrination with disinformation, masses of people, and militarization of the state, and then dehumanization of Ukrainian, of Brits, of Poles. We have, if you have any, it's, and even Russians, right? The enemies will spit you out like a fly. The enemies of Russia, and the purification of Russia that he thinks he's doing right now, it's very dangerous and reminiscent of what I'm talking about. And I think this is where he wants us to remain in that guilt space, whereas we should be clearly understanding the nature of Putin's system and attacking the pillars of that system so that the system starts making mistakes, starts stalling, start becoming dysfunctional, and then people inside Russia, those who I honestly believe why we have this aggressive wars is because they're trying to protect the core of Russia. This is what is deep down a fear of Russian leadership. How do you keep Russia as an integral state, this cohesion of a very patchy federation that is not even a federation, because these federal districts have no power and authority compared to Ukrainian decentralization even, not to mention German federal state, for example. And I think this is where their real fear of Russia is disintegration of Russia.
Bill, who you keenest reads this book?
I'm sorry?
I could actually modify Ewan's question. You don't have 5 copies, you've got 1 copy, and the person has to read it. Who is that person?
That's a very good question. Well, I mean, I think that it's really, anybody, I think that, I guess in this case it should be the U.S. president who should read this book, because all these people are surrounded by Sovietologists, political scientists, and this is not a political science story. This is this is an organized crime story, and if you read my book, you understand that it's like it's clear, it's well documented, and it's proven that this is just a criminal regime. And if you treat it like a normal regime, and you negotiate with Putin, or you thinking of him as a normal world leader, you're going to come to the wrong outcome.
Okay, we can move on to the next 3 questions. So the first question is right at the front here. If we could get one of the roving mics.
Hello, hi, I'm Sarah. I don't have any connection to Russia, but I'm just a huge fan of the books and also admirer of your justice campaign, Bill. And I wanted to ask, if really what Putin cares about is money, and I presume for him it's only good if he can spend it in the West. In your investigations, is it really known where his personal wealth sits? And do you think the Magnitsky Act or other legislation could ever be successful in taking that away from him.
Thank you. The second question, right at the front here, please. Thanks.
Thank you. David Anderson from the House of Lords. Building on Sarah's question, also a big fan of the book and a big fan of what you've done with Magnitsky sanctions. But of course, even Magnitsky sanctions only freeze money, they don't take it away. And you attributed to Putin in your introductory remarks the thought that what can be frozen can also be unfrozen. So my question is whether you have pursued, or whether you think it is at all realistic to pursue, with any of these 33 jurisdictions that have imposed Magnitsky sanctions, the possibility of transforming them into confiscation power, whether to use the money to rebuild Ukraine or for some other purpose.
And then the third question, the man with the glasses, different man with the glasses, with his hand up. Thanks. Of course.
Thank you very much. I'm Kim, I'm from UCL. I just have actually a couple of questions. First question is about the oligarchs and the nature of their influence. We've seen from various people like Abramovich, Deripaska and others that they are anti-war, don't support it. And basically I feel like in the West there's a misconception that, I mean at least that's how I feel, that the oligarchs can do anything. But since the time of Khodorkovsky imprisonment, we've seen that it's actually not true. So I'm just wondering, how can you approach it in a different way? Because it seems to me that everyone, even those within the inner circle of Putin, like Chemezov, he even, like recently I've seen him quote that he doesn't support the war in the sense that he doesn't believe that Russia should be isolated. So it's clearly a sign of disloyalty. The other question I have is about actually John Mearsheimer and his approach to, I mean, I know he's really controversial, but and we've all read the Economist article about, that West got it wrong somehow again.
Yeah.
And the last question I have is about the speculation about Germany and the sabotage of bringing more weapons to Ukraine, and generally this whole approach to giving more long-term contracts to Ukraine, etc., etc. So what do you think generally about this whole thing?
From 3 questions to 6. So, panelists.
So I can nail 2 of them in one go, and then
Great.
and I've got an answer for the third as well. So the 2 questions are about oligarchs, and the first question is, how do you get to Putin's wealth? And the answer is, he doesn't hold any money in his own name. He holds the money in the name of people he trusts, oligarchs. And so if you want to go after Putin, so it was wonderful the day, it was like a few days into the war when all these countries announced they were sanctioning Putin, but that's all just pure symbolism because he doesn't hold any money in his own name. He's got like a garage, a car, and an apartment or something. But the oligarchs hold the money in his name, hold money in their name on his behalf. And so the way you go after Putin's money, and we have gone after Putin's money, is by sanctioning the richest oligarchs who look after his money, because the oligarchs don't exist as independent financial people. They're not independently wealthy. They're dependently wealthy, and they're dependent on Vladimir Putin to, basically they exist at his permission. And in order to get his permission, 2 things have to happen. One is they have to hand over half their wealth to him. And 2, they have to do whatever he asks them to do. And coming to your point about Abramovich and Deripaska saying they're anti-war, have you ever heard the word war out of either of their mouths? If you look at, and I've analyzed it, I've analyzed it. They don't mention the word war, they don't mention the word invasion, and they don't mention the word Putin. And you could go through the entire list of oligarchs, and they come up with these carefully threaded statements, all avoiding anything that violates the compact they have with Putin, which is not to say the words that he doesn't want them to say. And so, and the intention is not to have them rise up and take Putin out. I mean, some governments may have had that intention, but that's not going to happen. The intention is that these are people who are bankers, custodians, nominees, proxies, and financial supporters of Vladimir Putin. And if you want to cut off his money, you cut off their money. And to your question about what to do with this money, it's a really great question, and it's remarkable that, I spent 10 years thinking about, just passionately trying to get this money frozen, and we never actually thought about what happens after it's frozen. I mean, it's a remarkable lack of sort of logic on my part and the part of the people I worked with, that we never thought about what do you do with that money. We just didn't want the people who had it to be able to use it. Yeah. And the great thing about the Magnitsky Act is that it's almost impossible to have that money unfrozen. So there's nothing you can do to say, well, I was a human rights violator and I'm not now, and therefore I should get the money back. Yeah. But thankfully, I'm not the only person involved in this discussion, and there's a very smart Canadian senator named Ratma Odemeyer, who put together a piece of legislation in Canada, which has now been passed, which is called the sort of Asset Recovery and Repurposing Act, or something like that, which has now takes what's been frozen under Magnitsky and can be then repurposed for the victims. I think it's complex, extremely complex when it gets to the oligarchs, because all the money supposedly doesn't belong to them and it's not Putin. There's a million different arguments they'll make in front of a court, but it's not complex when it comes to the $350 billion that's been frozen, the central bank money. That's a very simple situation where the government of Russia has committed a crime. It's the crime of aggression. You can quantify the damages created by that crime, and you can point to the assets held by the government, which are being frozen right now. And I think that $350 billion is like low-hanging fruit for rebuilding Ukraine. I think there'll be 25 years of litigation when it comes to the oligarchs. And of course, we should go after that money too, but I think that governments are going to have a lot harder time making that case.
There's also, I think you can use laws for asset forfeiture if you can link them to money laundering, which should help out if you wanted to seize assets. Not so much of the oligarchs that we were speaking about before, like Abramovich, who have proper businesses that make stuff and are functional, but there are other politicians and whatnot who really shouldn't have that money. So theoretically, you could link them to money laundering and seize it that way.
Yeah, I think there has to be more thinking done about this economic warfare in a way, because this is what we are into this area, to be honest, with the level of sanctions now, even on those assets of the Russian National Bank, right? I mean, I think that is something that they didn't expect to happen. And then the question is about the designing a legal vehicle for compensations, recovery, and I think just the design of it would send a very strong message that the West is serious about it, that it's not going to erode, and they will go through lawsuits and they will unfreeze the assets, because this is the calculus is, the sanctions will erode and they will get the upper hand. Perhaps setting up a transatlantic asset, sanction management and asset management institution, or something that would, in a way, on one hand, to keep track of it is a very complex system, but also communicate very clear to the Russians that, because Putin believes that the West will never lift sanctions, this will never happen. But there has to be a clear message. Yes, these sanctions were imposed in response to illegal aggression, as it was voted by the UN National General Assembly. In this resolution of 141 countries, it said Russia has to withdraw unconditionally its troops from Ukraine's territory. If you withdraw your troops from Ukraine's territory, sanctions will be lifted. And this is how it will be done. And I think this is a very important message also to Russians, to Russian people, to Russian elite, because Putin is trying, to conflate everything in Russian psyche, in Russian mind, that there's no truth, there's no guilt, there's, everybody is equally bad, the West is bad, yes, Russia is also bad, but accept us, or take it or leave it, right? And I think it's important that we have very clear-cut strategic communication on that. No, there are consequences for your actions. These are the consequences for the actions.
Yeah, but of course, if you have a system where I agree it would be good if there was a way to correct the action and then be unfrozen, or denounce Putin and give, and then have your assets unfrozen, etc. But it's got to kind of be one or the other. You can't seize assets and then spend them on compensating Ukrainians and also have that way out. But I also think, just to pick up on your point about the seriousness of the West, one of the things that in a way lets it down is a seeming inability to, particularly I think America, an inability to take on a lot of the pain of sort of inflation and reluctance to sanction particularly oligarchs who are responsible for, a big chunk of, say, the nickel market or the aluminium market, etc. Because the Biden administration, whilst leading from the front, by sharing all of the intelligence and warning the world that this was going to happen, they're incredibly reluctant to jeopardize their political standing. And I think that the West, in that sense, needs to take a look at itself and how serious it is about economic sanctions, and also take a long look in the mirror about the erosion of Western institutions. This is our banks, courts, etc., that have allowed money laundering to take place at such a massive scale. And it's not just Russian dirty money; it's lots of nations. Yeah. Let's not just completely. Western institutions have been at fault, and these banks, and particularly the banking system and Danske Bank, etc. And that reform is needed there beyond Russia.
And maybe on the question of, I'm not going to play Mearsheimer because I'll be terrible at this, but I think that it's a little bit to the argument of like this intellectual laziness about complacency, that we could imagine that some countries could have a limited sovereignty because Russia has the right to some sphere of influence. This is basically, people like Kissinger and Mearsheimer, they say that, big countries do what they, want, small countries do what they can. Is this the world we want to live in? I mean, Ukraine says no to this, and it's big enough European country that is trying to assert its sovereignty. And I think what we've done wrong, and think about 2004 Orange Revolution, Ukraine was trying to get the EU candidate status, but what did EU gave us? Neighborhood policy. Sorry, nobody took it seriously in Ukraine. And I think the problem we have in this particular part of the world is that in countries like Ukraine, Moldova, there is a real revolution where these countries belong, while the West is completely lost what to do with these countries. Now we are forcing, Ukraine is forcing the West to reassess what Europe is. It's not the club of some kind of closed nations. You cannot compartmentalize your security. It's impossible. Look at food security. Look at what's next. Look at the migration that Putin hoped that this influx of Ukrainian migrants would scare European Union. But no, this didn't happen. What went wrong after Georgia? Were there any repercussions for Russia? No. And I can go on. And even after the annexation of Crimea, the sanctions were a real joke. If we look at the sanctions today, it took MH17. It took MH17, that disaster in the Ukrainian sky, for some kind of more or less sanctions to be introduced. So I think if we look at us honestly, at ourselves, I think we should be ashamed,
We have around 10 minutes left, so I think we only have time for 2 questions. So apologies for those people that we can't get to. First question is the woman on the front row, please.
So I had 2 questions, but I won't cheat because there isn't enough time. So I'll go with the second one, which is we've talked almost exclusively about the West, really. And are we missing a big part of the picture here by not talking more about other countries who also have, growing economies or shrinking economies or defaulting on their debt, and the impact that can have since we're also seeking things from them, or we need them to get grain or get food or whatever it is.
And then the second question, the man in the middle row, please. Thanks.
Richard Lipson, former C student. Thank you, Bill Browder. I remember seeing you a few years ago at the Foreign Policy Committee when you were talking about your adventures with red notices from Interpol, and you stood out then, and I'm glad to see you're still here. Our friend from Siberia and our friend here touched on a very important subject. Is tyranny a better system of government than democracy? And that's what we really got to think. And Dasha touched on it at all. In the Second World War, this country went to the defense of Poland, a lost cause if ever there was one. But we went, and we went full in, and it worked. Russians have a system, it's called, when they play poker, they go full in every time, and Putin's gone full in. If we're going to dance around talking about NATO and the UN, I mean, how many countries abstained in the UN conference on condemning Russia? 35 abstentions, including India, Pakistan, and China. If we're going to do something, surely the long-term pain of sanctions is a little bit dangerous. I came here to UCL and heard the EU ambassador to Britain talk a very bureaucratic talk, which didn't give me any confidence that you could rely on Europe for more than a bag of peas. Don't you feel that there's a moral fight to get the West, America, Britain, and Europe to feel that Ukraine is fighting the Third World War on its own, and it really needs some help now?
Thank you.
Sorry, it went on a bit long.
Who wants to take the first question? Really, we need to be talking about the global south as well, and not just the West.
Yeah.
Sorry, there you go. Oh, I could just tackle it really quickly, which I think isn't necessarily the thing that you're talking about, but we haven't really talked about India, China in particular, but India, for example, is encouraging its state oil companies to potentially take over Russian assets. You know, it's benefiting from cheap oil. China's position in this, Chinese companies are also benefiting from cheap oil, and that's the real issue in limiting the effectiveness of Western sanctions against Russia, is that there's this huge other market. And I totally agree with you. It's agree that if sanctions are to be effective, these countries have to get on board. But there's an interesting bit with Kazakhstan speaking out quite bluntly and criticizing the break of, saying that Lugansk and Donetsk are not independent states, that, they're essentially Ukrainian, whilst at the St. Petersburg Forum, which is quite a snub for Putin, especially considering Putin helped out Tokayev just in January during their putsch. And I wonder if, Tokayev, the president of Kazakhstan, would ever dare say anything like this in St. Petersburg if Big Brother China hadn't instructed them to. So it's just, who knows? But it's just a hint of maybe things are changing.
I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum a few weeks ago, and it was really a shock to me because exactly what you were saying. We all think, Canada and Australia and France and Netherlands were all together, and like everyone's on the right side of right here. And there you had South Africa and India and all these people who were like not on our side at all. And it was just the strangest thing because the global south are the ones who are going to have more deaths from this war than anybody else. I think the number of people who are going to die of starvation will be orders of magnitude greater than the number of Ukrainians dying from bombs and bullets. And the logic, like South Africa. South Africa, somehow they because of some historic, thing where the Soviets supported the African National Congress, that they're going to side with this, using a great word you use, klepto-fascist or klepto-nationalism. It's just irrational. That just makes no sense at all. And so these countries are basically siding with the people who are going to cause them death and starvation, and it just makes no sense. And if they can't do it out of their own self-interest, then we should probably start to, unfortunately, we have to kind of divide the world. And I can't remember the name of the guy. I think he was the president of Senegal. Was making all these nice. Putin met with him recently, and he made all these nice statements to Putin. And I went online to look it up, and America supplies $157 million of foreign aid to Senegal. kind of have to pick sides, I think. If you want to side with Putin, then why in the world should we give him $157 million? We could use that money elsewhere.
But here I think it's very important, the agency of Ukraine in particular, for Ukraine to tell the story, what this war is about. Because of course in the global south, in Latin America, Russia is playing this anti-American narrative that you were always exploited by the West. Look, they've just drained your resources, and now they're doing the same in Ukraine, like Putin's comment that Ukraine, member of EU, will be a colony of European Union, right? So I think we have to make sure that, and Ukraine in particular understands that it has to talk to the global south to explain the damage that Putin's war caused to their populations. And I think it's not so much democracy versus autocracy, it's just simply humanity versus inhumanity, rule-based order versus chaos and nuclear blackmail, right? Because this is what Putin does. And I think also we have to be aware, something that has been perpetuated in Latin America, the RT Spanish, these narratives, they are still out there polluting the information space, and there has to be an honest conversation among civil society, academia, journalists about how dangerous it is. Look at the case of Ukraine. Ukraine has to shut down all this Russian propaganda, disinformation, because it leads to polarization and in the end instrumentalizes the war. And just to finish on, I think, I met a woman in Poland who had to flee. Her son was studying in Poland, and she told me, look, my son was always telling me, come, be with me, let's live in Poland. And she was always hesitating. She's from Vinnytsia near Kiev. And now with the war that started, she had to flee. And she told me, Putin stole my choice. She was angry. And I do not see enough Russians who understand that Putin stole their country. And not only stole their country, he turned Russia into the pariah state, conducted war crimes, stole $1 trillion from the Russian people, and in Ukraine, people are angry, and then they are active in doing something about it. And I do hope that there will be also enough Russians that will understand that this is what Putin did, that they are angry, and they want to have a choice of what kind of Russia they will have as a country. Because without that, it will be very difficult for all of us, to be honest.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the event. Apologies again to those people who weren't able to ask their questions. I encourage you to use the hashtag #TakingOnPutin. You can ask the questions to the panelists on Twitter, or you can accost them after the event. Thank you very much for some excellent questions from the audience. A reminder that Bill's book, Freezing Order, is available for sale in the foyer. Please join me now in thanking Bill, Orysia and Dasha for an excellent event.
Thank you. It's great to see you.